Chapter 28 from Graham Farmello's biography of Paul Dirac. Old men have a weakness for generality and a desire to see structures whole. That is why old scientists often become philosophers. From The Recollections of Eugene P. Wigner, 1992, autobiography. The advice Barbara Walters, doyenne of celebrity viewers, gave in her 1971 book, How to Talk to Practically Anybody About Practically Anything, did not quite extend to making conversation with Paul Dirac. Yet the director of publicity at the Miami Museum of Science, Dorothy Holcomb, wished she had read the book when she was trying to wrest a few words from him during a buffet reception in his honour on the evening of the 8th of March 1971. After he replied to her hi with a blank hello, she realised that the only way to get him to speak more than a few words at a time was to ask him to pick the topic of the conversation, and he chose comic strips. For several minutes he talked with surprising fluency about the merits of two strips he had been reading since the 1930s. The 5th century adventure Prince Valiant and Blondie, a carefree flapper girl who settled down to family life in suburbia. Holcomb was quite charmed. When Dirac admitted that he could not make head nor tail of the quirkier humour of Peanuts, she suggested that he should try a little harder to understand American humour, and he agreed. Afterwards, Holcomb made up her mind to buy a copy of The Principles of Quantum Mechanics and also How to Talk to Practically Anybody About Practically Anything. As Holcomb will have seen, if she got to the end of Walter's book, it concludes with good advice for anyone who had vainly tried to draw Dirac into conversation. You cannot win them all. Before this conversation, Dirac had given a lecture entitled Evolution of Our Understanding of Nature, which ranged well beyond physics. Still haunted by the early scenes in 2001 Space Odyssey, Dirac began by discussing how early humans understood mechanics of growing grain, graduating from beliefs based on superstition to ideas based on theories grounded in observation. He opposed critics of the Apollo space program who believed that the money should be spent instead on social programs. People equate all the different kinds of human activity to money are taking too primitive a view of things, he said. The solution to social problems was not, Dirac argued, to be cheese pairing with the space program and fundamental research, but rather to avoid the great waste that is all around us, especially the unemployment of people who want to come to work. Look at the hippies in California, he said. They welcome the challenge to help fight forest fires rather than just laze around. Dirac's reputation as a speaker enabled him and Mancy to sate their appetite for international tourism. Florida State gave him the freedom to travel and everything else he needed, in addition to a modest income, an office, companionship, financial support for his research, and most importantly, respect. The university officials regarded him with a reverence that often cloyed into obsequiousness, and they regarded Mancy as his queen. She whiled away hours chatting and exchanging risque jokes with the university's clubbable president, Bernie Sligger, knowing that he would always take her phone calls and be sympathetic to her every request. In return, the university asked only that Dirac be available when they wanted to display their most illustrious professor to visiting dignitaries. He played along and had some success in disguising his boredom. Only once, when his compliance was taken for granted, did Dirac's patience run out. He locked himself in his house, and Kurt Hoffer had to persuade him to come out just in time to meet an important visitor. Beyond the light supervision of a few graduate students, Dirac had no teaching responsibilities. But in 1973 he agreed to present a series of lectures on the general theory of relativity, aiming to develop the theory from its fundamental principles and to lay bare its logical structure. One of the physics students in the audience, Pam Humer, recalls, "The first lecture was standing room only. He began so simply that the office cleaners could have understood what is meant by position, what is meant by time, and so on. Later he built on these foundations brick by brick, making every step of the construction look inevitable. The funny thing was that he never once compared the theory with experiment. He just kept stressing how beautiful it all was. Only a few students made it to the end of the course, but for those who did, it was an unforgettable experience." Dirac presented the lectures most years until 1980 and used them as the basis of his short book General Theory of Relativity, a minor classic of exposition, describing the theory in 69 pages without a single diagram. In Tallahassee, the Dirac's home was about 20 minutes leisurely walk from his office on the 3rd floor of the university's Keene building in the heart of the campus. Each weekday morning after breakfast he would link his hands behind his back and walk slowly to his office across a local field, the route that ensured minimum contact with the neighborhood dogs. In summer, when he wore his baseball cap, he looked like an all-American retiree, but on the coldest days of winter, when he put on the heavy overcoat he had brought almost 50 years before in Lord and Taylor's, he looked every inch the venerable English professor. He often carried a 40-year-old umbrella. "It was my father's," he told his colleagues. In his office he worked at his desk for 3 hours, pausing occasionally to visit the library. To unexpected visitors who knocked on his office door, he often had a simple message: "Go away." When the phone rang, he would often lift the receiver off the hook and imminently drop it, without bothering to listen to the caller's voice. At noon, he would join a few colleagues for a brown bag lunch. Dirac usually said nothing, but would occasionally interject with a comment, perhaps on the impenetrability of American football, or about the wisdom of trying to educate so many undergraduates in science, when so few of them had an aptitude for the subject, or even took much pleasure from studying it. He was fond of jokes, especially ones dependent on the interpretation of a single word, and ones with a slight sexual edge. This was one of his favourites. There is a small village. A newly appointed priest decided to call on his parishioners, and in one modest home teeming with children, he was greeted by the lady of the house. He asked her how many children she and her husband had, and she said 10, 5 pairs of twins. The priest said, "You always have twins?" To which the woman replied, "Oh no, Father, sometimes we had nothing." After lunch he would return to his office for a nap on his sofa, and sometimes attend a seminar, often appearing to sleep through most of it before returning home for late afternoon with tea with Mancy. After dinner, he would relax. He and Mancy might go to a classical concert, or he might read a novel, for instance Edgar Allan Poe's mysteries, or a Le Carre spy thriller, or Hoyle's science fiction stories, these being among his favourites, or watch television with Mancy in the family room, dominated by a painting of his daughter Judy when she was a child. Dirac watched most of the Nova science documentaries, but the programmes that he and Mancy regarded as unmissable were period dramas, the Forsyte Saga. Dirac was spellbound by the leading lady, Nairi Dawn Porter, and Upstairs Downstairs, dramatising the class divisions between the servants and their masters in an Edwardian household. On the night an episode of the television programme was broadcast, the Diracs would accept dinner invitations with friends, but only if their hosts agreed in advance to watch it with them in silence. One dispute about the evening television schedule threatened to get out of hand when there was a clash between Cher's Sunday night television show, a highlight of Dirac's week, and the live broadcast of the Oscar ceremony, which Mancy was desperate to see. And the dispute was resolved days later, but at a price. They bought a second television. The couple did not always resolve their differences so amicably. In August 1972, they had what may have been the worst row of their marriage when they were visiting the recently widowed Betty at her apartment in Alicante, on the southeast coast of Spain. The relationship between the sisters-in-law had been brittle. Part of the problem was that Mancy made no secret that she found Betty dull and idle, while Betty was vexed by Mancy's unrelenting bossiness. Tempers flared during a conversation on the apartment balcony when Dirac backed up his sister after she made a sly comment about the behaviour of Hungarians in Budapest at the end of the war. Mancy stormed out of town and wrote to Dirac in a rage. "You looked at me and then you did all you could to hurt, scare and humiliate me and embarrass me greatly. It is a fact. Most mental inmates have been driven there by their families. On that fifth-floor balcony I felt your presence whenever I was there alone, urging me to jump. You cruelly, uncaringly, completely identified yourself with my tormentor, and this I did not earn or deserve. I do not feel you are a husband, as it is understood by millions. Yes, keep your loyalties to the one you are so similar to, and in lacking human emotions, and learn not to care or want to die. And I learn not to care or want to die." But a few days later she wrote to him again in a completely different tone. "Thank you for your loving care, for your love, warm and affection, for your taking notice when I am sick or in pain, for heeding my needs, for allowing me to read your wishes from unspoken words, for allowing me near you when you are ill or depressed, for forgiving my ills and extravagances, for never making me anxious and panicky, for treating me always as an equal, always justly and fairly, for trying your best to make us around you happy and cheerful. I thank you." In Trieste, a month later, at a symposium organised by Abdus Salam to mark Dirac's 70th birthday, Heisenberg and all the other guests saw the Diracs on their best form, the model of the contented elderly couple. But Dirac apparently did not want to put the unpleasantness of the previous few weeks completely behind him. He clipped Mancy's 2 notes together and filed them among his papers in his office. He appeared to regard all her attacks and the makings up that followed with an equanimity bordering on indifference. Whether he suffered more deeply than others saw, we shall probably never know, as he appears not to have discussed her behaviour, still less to have complained about her with anyone. To the Dirac's acquaintances in their later years, Mancy was a controversial figure. No one questioned that her gift for friendship hugely enriched his social life, and that she was devoted to her husband, my little Mickey Mouse, as she called him. Many colleagues attest to the care she took to look after him and make him look presentable. One visitor was touched to see her adjusting his clothes when he returned home one evening, looking like a scarecrow. "She takes such good care of me," Dirac beamed as Mancy adjusted his tie. Without her, he would probably have spent most of his entire adult life living alone in college, like Charlie Broad. Yet many friends could not help flinching when she shouted at him, "Are you listening to me?" and wondered how he felt when he silently bore her tirades against nigger doctors and Jews. That Mancy was both Jewish and occasionally anti-Semitic was one of the most baffling paradoxes of her personality. Yorick Blumenfeld gives a bleak summary of the state of their 34-year-old marriage. She was tired of henpecking him, and he just wanted to live in his dream world. Helene Blumenfeld is surprised that he could tolerate her. He was a lovely man. She was simply an awful person, was his summary. Her summary. But Lily Harish Chandra, a frequent visitor to the Dirac's home and a family friend, disagrees. Mancy was extremely warm and loyal, a great listener and a very caring woman. Paul cannot have been easy to live with. Their marriage worked because they gave each other what they each wanted. He gave her status, and she gave him a life. In the early 1970s, Dirac was briefly optimistic about his research on particle physics. He had happened on a new way of describing isolated elementary particles with a spin equal to a whole number, using an equation that he believed had a special mathematical beauty. Better yet, it described only positive energies. The mathematics yielded no embarrassing negative energy solutions. But his excitement waned after he found it impossible to use the equation to describe how a particle interacts with other particles or with a field, the real-world case. Mathematical beauty had again proven to be a treacherous beacon. Dirac then wound down his work on the theory of fundamental particles and returned to general relativity and his still unproven large numbers hypothesis. He knew that Einstein's theory and the hypothesis were incompatible because general relativity requires, in the language of Newtonian mechanics, that the strength of the gravitational force between two identical masses separated by the same distance has always had the same value, contrary to the hypothesis. So he tried to reconcile them using ideas set out by a former colleague at the Institute for Advanced Study, the German mathematician Hermann Weyl, whose approach to theoretical physics resembled Dirac's. Weyl once said, "My work always tried to unite the truth with the beautiful, but when I had to choose one or the other, I usually chose the beautiful." In 1922, Weyl had produced a prototype theory that gave a tantalizing glimpse of how a mathematical account of gravity and electromagnetism might be given with a unified set of equations. Enthralled by their beauty, Dirac believed Whale's approach might furnish a link between the general theory of relativity and the large numbers hypothesis, in a way that involved a gradual weakening of gravity over time. Dirac was assisted in the project by Leopold Halpern, a general relativity specialist who arrived at Tallahassee in 1974, a year short of his 50th birthday. Born and raised in Austria, he and his family had fled on Hitler's invasion in 1938 when he was just 13 years old. He spent 27 years working in several European research institutions, including a spell with Schrödinger, and Dirac had first met him at a conference in 1962. Halpern was a homeopath and a certified African medicine man, a 24-carat eccentric who slept outdoors all year round, sliced baked potatoes with karate chops, and refused to wash with soap. He was not always popular in elevators. Colleagues with conventional manners were then often disconcerted by the prickliness that disguised his shyness. When his phone rang, he would answer with a rasping, impatient "Hello?" his voice softening into lilt the moment that he realized he was talking to a friend. The oddities and coarse manners of Halpern grated on Mansi, but they endeared him to Dirac, and the two men became close friends. At least once a week they went swimming in Silver Lake and Lost Lake, two of Dirac's favourite spots near Tallahassee, mainly because the waters there were so quiet. Dirac did not like to swim anywhere near motorboats, but on one trip, when he was 76 years old, he hailed one and asked the owner if he could have a go at water skiing. The owner obliged, and when Halpern told Mansi, she was horrified. "Oh, Paul is so very immature, still very immature." Most weekends, the two men headed off for Halpern's Volkswagen Super Beetle, his 16-foot canoe and a pair of paddles tied to the roof rack, on the hour-long drive to the Waukulla River. Minutes after setting off from the shore, they would be alone in one of Florida's most pleasant microclimates, a near wilderness. They would row for some 2 hours upstream on the slow-flowing river, through forests of sassafras and American beech trees, draped with Spanish moss. The alligators made scarcely a sound, and the silence was broken only by the rhythmic sloshing of the paddles, the cry of a circling osprey, the occasional shuffling of wind passing through shoreline gaps in the forest. After a snack lunch at Snake Point, Dirac and Halpern would strip off and go for a swim before they rowed back to their starting point, scarcely exchanging a word. These were idyllic, private hours. Occasionally they would invite a visitor to join them, but it had to be someone who could be relied on to stay silent most of the time. One of the visitors was Kursonoglu, who went along dressed in his three-piece suit, tie and Stetson. Halfway through the trip, he stood up in the canoe to admire the scenery, only for Dirac to dump him in the river and then collapse in a fit of laughter. Dirac and Halpern often arrived home several hours late, half-heartedly suppressing shame, like a pair of errant schoolboys, when they were explaining themselves to a frantic Mansi. Halpern assured her week after week that the Waukulla wildlife posed no danger at all. "If you leave the snakes and the alligators alone," he said, "they'll do nothing to harm you." Halpern could not understand what she was worried about. In the 1970s, particle physics underwent what amounted to a revolution. After decades of uncertainty, physicists achieved a new clarity about the workings of the universe at the finest level. Everything in the universe is made of a few basic particles, a handful of leptons and quarks, and a small number of particles that mediate their interactions, as described by quantum field theory, simple enough to be spelt out on a t-shirt. The Dirac equation describes the electromagnetic interactions of all the leptons and quarks, each with the same spin as the electrons. In the past 50 years, physicists have come up with quite a few attention-grabbing labels for their new concepts, but they allowed this description of weak electromagnetic and strong interactions, one of the supreme syntheses of 20th century thought, to be given the most prosaic of names, the Standard Model. One of the first important steps towards the consensus was taken by Dirac's former student Abdus Salam and by the American theorist Steven Weinberg, who independently suggested in 1967 that the weak and electromagnetic interactions might be understood in a unified way by describing them in terms of a special type of gauge theory whose underlying mathematical symmetry is broken. For several years, the Weinberg-Salam theory was not taken seriously, as it appeared to suffer an even more serious infestation of unwanted infinities than quantum electrodynamics, the theory of photons and of electrons. All this changed in the early 1970s, after the Dutch theoreticians Gerard von 't Hooft and Martin Veltman proved that the infinities in the theory, and all other gauge theories, could be removed by renormalization. The Weinberg-Salam theory quickly commanded wide interest and support. Also around at this time, theorists improved their understanding of renormalization, so that it was much more rigorous than the sweeping under the carpet dodge that Dirac deplored. Renormalization was now widely regarded as a rigorous branch of mathematical physics, with no sleight of hand, but Dirac vehemently disagreed. Soon, physicists found a gauge theory of strong interactions called quantum chromodynamics, with the same underpinnings as the Weinberg-Salam theory. It turned out that it was possible to describe the strong interaction between quarks as being mediated by massless particles which Gell-Mann named gluons. Quarks are never observed in isolation, the theory says, because the strong force prevents them from being separated, though when quarks are close together, they behave as if they were free. So the neutron, first observed by Chadwick just over 30 years before, could be re-envisaged as a compassionate prism for quarks. They cannot escape their confinement, but they are free when they are inside it. Rutherford's vision of a typical atom as electrons orbiting a tiny nucleus of protons and neutrons, a gnat in a space the size of the Albert Hall, as it had been described, had been superseded. Now, the most fundamental way of imagining an atom was in terms of relativistic quantum field theory. The quarks in the nucleus were quantum excitations of the field associated with the strong interaction, just as the orbiting electron was the quantum excitations of the electromagnetic field. Everything in an atom can be described in terms of such fields. Rutherford would have choked on such abstractions, yet they were apparently inevitable consequences of a century of labour by his fellow experimenters and their theoretical colleagues. Although the Standard Model left many questions unanswered, no one fully understood the particle's masses, for example. Its setting out in the 1970s was a high point in the history of science. But Dirac was fairly unmoved, ensconced with Halpern in their Tallahassee redoubt. The new discoveries left him cold, and he appeared to take no great pleasure to see other theoreticians find a way of describing strong interactions using a field theory of the type that he had pioneered, as scattering matrices fell into disuse. He no longer kept up to date with the latest physics journals and was beginning to make errors in his science, though no one was ungracious enough to say so in public. By the mid-1970s, Dirac had lost interest in particle physics, and Halpern noticed that he was less interested in news about field theory than in the renewed public debate about the origin of the Turin shroud, believed by some people to be the burial shroud of Jesus Christ. Although Dirac was impressed by the young particle theoreticians, he thought that they were deluded. Although his talks and occasional occasional publications, he urged them to devote all their time to clearing and disinfecting the Augean stables of renormalization, a job almost all physicists believed had already been done. By contrast, Heisenberg in Munich kept an open mind about the new theoretical developments until liver cancer took his life in February 1976, 6 years after his former teacher and friend Max Born had died in Göttingen. All Dirac's friends among the pioneers of quantum mechanics were now dead. At one time, the historical perspective on atomic physics was not important to him, but now he was keen to put his side of the story to historians and other physicists. And in these talks, he always took pains to emphasize the excitement of the early years of quantum mechanics, an emotion that, by all accounts, he rarely showed when he was living through that. He even included a reference to his feelings in the account that was the nearest he ever came to writing a scientific memoir, Recollections of an Exciting Era. In May 1980, while suffering from a bad dose of flu, Dirac travelled to Chicago to attend a conference on the history of particle physics at the Fermi National Accelerator Laboratory, Fermilab, where he spoke about the origins of quantum field theory. In a roundtable session, he went out of his way to criticize the destructiveness of Pauli's opposition when the idea of spin and the positron were first conceived. In another session, he presented his versions of the history of antimatter in a talk that Leon Lederman recalled as quintessential Dirac: clear, fluent, modest. The content poured out of him like heavy cream. When he had finished speaking, Vicky Weisskopf commented that Einstein had suggested the existence of a positive electron in 1925, some 6 years before Dirac's prediction. But Dirac was unperturbed. He waved a hand dismissively and remarked he was lucky, and moved on. Even for Dirac, modesty had its limits. Mancy was a generous hostess, able to make everyone in the room feel special and at ease. She often threw dinner parties, attentively filling her guests' glasses, serving generous portions of her favourite dishes, ensuring that the conversation kept moving. Dirac, sitting at the head of the table, would apparently spend most of the evening asleep. He could, however, be drawn into conversation if he were approached by a young woman, especially if she was friendly and attractive. His advice was often sought, but he usually declined to offer any. Often, when pressed, he would sometimes offer a few words, and one of his favourite replies was, "Think about yourself first. If nobody gets hurt, do it." A slightly egotistic summary of the view of the individual's moral responsibility, in the opinion of John Stuart Mill. Mansi would point out to guests a favourite photograph of Dirac warmly shaking hands with Pope John Paul II in the Vatican. "Paul and the Pope got on so well," she would tell them. Mansi would beam as if the two men met every weekend for a round of golf. The photograph was taken at one of several meetings between Dirac and the Pope at the Papal Academy, a group of distinguished scientists that offers the Pope disinterested scientific advice. Dirac had been elected to the Academy in 1961, the year after his friend the cosmologist Georges Lemaitre became its president. The Dirac's friend Kurt Hofer recalls Mansi's pride in her husband. After showing guests the papal photograph, she unpacked a collection of postal stamps from all over the world, each bearing a portrait of Paul Dirac. He pretended to be embarrassed, but he never did anything to prevent her from doing it. It was during one of Hofer's weekly visits to 223 Chapel Drive that Dirac unexpectedly disgorged his recollections of his father. Dirac trusted only his closest friends with those unexpurgated memories, although the circumstances of Felix's death were still too distressing for him to share with anyone, even with Mansi. Dirac did, however, speak of his happier memories of Felix's life to Betty in October 1969, when she was in an Amsterdam hospital, lying in a coma after a stroke and a 7-hour brain operation. Alone at her bedside, he tried to coax her back into consciousness by telling her stories of their childhood, playing on the downs with Felix, the three of them bathing on Portishead Beach, sharing each other's books and comics. She regained consciousness a few weeks later and gradually made a partial recovery. Hofer recalls that Dirac thought organized religions were primitive and socially manipulative myths. Once, as he walked past a local Mormon church with a huge satellite dish, he scoffed that the church needed such a large dish so that it could communicate directly with God. Yet Dirac was now much more willing to introduce the concept of God into discussions about science. In June 1971, he had startled his audience at the Lindau meeting by concluding, "Is there a God?" to be one of the 5 most important questions in contemporary physics. He said it would be a useful approach to approach the question scientifically. A physicist would need to make this question precise by understanding what is meant by a universe with a God and what a universe without a God, having a clear distinction between the two types of universes, and then looking at the actual universe and seeing which class it belongs to. The audience laughed nervously and went quiet when he suggested a way of detecting the presence of God. If future scientists demonstrated that the creation of life is overwhelmingly unlikely, then, in Dirac's opinion, this would be evidence for the existence of God. Until that time, the hypothesis must be regarded as being unproven. Dirac was taken to task by the press for these speculations, but he was not to be deflected and often returned to the topic in public and in private. He took a dim view of any religion declaring itself to offer the only hope of salvation. Hofer remembers that Paul believed it was the height of arrogance for any group of people to claim that they alone knew the truth. He often pointed out that there are hundreds of religions on this planet and that it is impossible to know which one, if any, is the correct one. There was no trace of religiosity in Dirac, Halpern later wrote. He remembered that Dirac was especially critical of Catholicism and other religions that acknowledged miracles, because in his view the existence of a miracle implies a temporary breaking of the underlying laws of nature, whose beauty he regarded as sacred. Like Einstein, and largely following the philosopher Spinoza, Dirac appeared to take the pantheist view that the universe is either identical with God or in some way an expression of God's nature, a view that, though vague almost to the point of tautology, appears to rule out the notion of a God that can influence human affairs. Dirac's pantheism was an ascetic faith that observations on nature at the most fundamental level will be described perfectly by theories whose mathematical beauty is also perfect. If he had a religion, this was it. Dirac's modesty was genuine, but he was not above a little vanity. The Danish sculptor Harald Eisenstein, a specialist at portraying leading physicists, made two busts of Dirac, and both are good likenesses, if lacking in character. The first in 1939, which Dirac displayed in his home, and the next 32 years later. He offered the first Eisenstein bust to St. John's College, who accepted it and displayed it in their library where it stands today. The college also wanted a painting of Dirac in oils to be displayed in their hall, and Dirac went out of his way to oblige. In the early summer of 1978, he sat several times for Michael Noakes, portrait painter of the British royal family, and the year before of Frank Sinatra. In the first session, Noakes tried to help Dirac relax by drawing him into conversation. Noakes: "Can you put into layman's terms what you're working on, Professor?" Dirac: "Yes, creation." "Wow, tell me more." Dirac: "Creation was one vast bang. Talk of a steady state is nonsense." Noakes: "But if nothing existed beforehand, what was there to bang?" Dirac: "That is not a meaningful question." Dirac would say no more. Though unsettled by Dirac's reticence and apparent lack of interest, Noakes captured his abstracted gaze to infinity. Dirac, looking as innocent as a 5-year-old, as detached as an oracle. A comparison between this portrait and the first to be painted by his friend Yakov Frenkel in 1933, shortly after they heard of Ehrenfest's suicide, shows how much Dirac's confidence had drained away in the ensuing 45 years. His personality is best caught in the drawing made in 1963 by Robert Tolast, whose portrait expertly catches Dirac's childlike innocence. Less accomplished, but nevertheless competent, is the drawing of Dirac made 2 years later by Feynman, whose portrait shows signs of reverence. "I'm no Dirac," Feynman had said. Dirac kept his drawing in his filing cabinet. 20 years after Dirac declined a knighthood, he accepted the most prestigious offer of all, membership of the Order of Merit, which did not oblige himself to call him anything other than Mr. Dirac. The order is limited to 24 members of the British Commonwealth, judged by the Sovereign to have given exceptional service. Previous members had included Florence Nightingale, Winston Churchill, and William Walton. Mansie deplored that her husband was the last of his generation of Cambridge scientists to be honoured. J.J. Thomson, Eddington, Rutherford Cockcroft, and Blackett had all been admitted long before. In June 1973, the Diracs returned to the UK so that he could collect his award. A chauffeur drove them in a Rolls-Royce to Buckingham Palace, where he received the award in private from the Queen for a few minutes, while Mansie waited in an anteroom. A few weeks later, he shared with Esther and Meyer Salomon his discussions with the Queen about the challenges faced by a female scientist who is also the mother of young children. I said it was difficult for a woman who had to choose between her career and her family, and there could not be real equality between the sexes, and the Queen said that she did not press for equality of the sexes. On his return to the USA, Tallahassee colleagues quizzed Dirac about his impression of the Queen, but he would say very little. His description of her consisted of 2 words, very small. That summer, Dirac visited CERN in Geneva to see its newest particle accelerator, capable of increasing the energy of protons to some 50,000 times the energy reached by Cockcroft and Walton's device. During his visit, he walked to the Rue Winkelried, a side street near the lake, and close to the main railway station, to see the apartment owned until the mid-1920s by his paternal grandmother, where he and his family stayed in 1905. As he strolled around the nearby statue of Rousseau, Dirac may have thought of the time he spent running around the lakeside park with Felix, watched by his father and mother, baby Betty, in her arms. Dirac had not visited Switzerland since then, despite many invitations. The pain of the country's association with his father had been so deep that Dirac had not been able to bring himself to visit it until he was 70 years old. In 1979, the centenary of Einstein's birth, Dirac was feeling weak and listless, but he was determined to speak at many of the celebrity meetings, as many of them as he could, so that he could make clear what a great scientist Einstein was, as Halpern recalled. During that year, Dirac achieved one of his ambitions, flying across the Atlantic on Concorde, the first supersonic passenger aircraft. The aircraft, developed by an Anglo-French collaboration in the 1960s, was noisy, a prodigious guzzler of fuel, and hopelessly uneconomic. But it symbolized the best and most exciting in contemporary engineering. It was the apogee of the aviation industry in Dirac's native city. The Bristol Aeroplane Company had led the first British design team to work on the aircraft and then build the first British prototype in Filton, a few miles from his home in Julius Road. Somehow Mansie persuaded UNESCO to fund transatlantic flights on the aircraft for Dirac and herself, as a condition of his attending the organisation's Einstein celebrations in Paris as guest of honour. He and Mansie took the flight on the 5th of May 1979, cruising at almost 60,000 feet, the nearest Dirac would ever get to outer space. During the flight, he probably read on the front page of the New York Times the news from Britain that Margaret Thatcher had just become Prime Minister. He may have wondered whether his mother's fears about the notion of a woman Prime Minister would be realised, whether Mrs. Thatcher would, in Flo's words, vacillate in her feminine way, so that her supporters would fall off left and right. By spring 1982, when Dirac and Kapitsa were tired of travel, 3 opportunities to meet that summer arose, and they seized them. Accompanied by their wives, they first met at Lindau, a meeting at the end of June. Kapitsa had been eligible to attend the meeting only since he received the Nobel Prize for Physics in 1978, after Dirac had lobbied for him for almost 40 years. During that time, Dirac had seen the honour awarded to almost all of Rutherford's most able boys, Blackett, Chadwick, Cockcroft and Walton, and virtually all the pioneers of quantum mechanics from the 20s to the 30s had received the prize, including Bjorn, Fermi, Landau, Pauli, Tam and Van Vleck, but not Jordan, whose Nazi past probably cost him the honour. At the Lindau meeting, Dirac mounted one of his last attacks on renormalization in front of an audience of some 200 students and Nobel laureates. Looking as fragile as cut-glass figurine, Dirac stood at the rostrum giving a speech almost identical to ones he had been giving for almost 50 years. He had no praise for the Standard Model or any other successes of particle physics. A microphone amplified his trembling voice, each letter S accompanied by a whistle from his ill-fitting dentures. Current theories were just a set of working rules, he said. Physicists should go back to basics and find a Hamiltonian description of nature free of infinities. Someday, he said, with a gentle and weary defiance, people will find the correct Hamiltonian. But he was preaching a lost cause. Physicists no longer based their descriptions of fundamental particles on Hamiltonians, as other methods were much more convenient. But the audience listened respectively to Dirac's 25-minute speech, perhaps partly in anticipated sadness that his lone voice would soon be silent. Here was someone like Einstein who was unafraid of bucking contemporary trends and taking the consequences to be his own man. The Diracs and Kapitzas met again a few days later in Göttingen. Kapitsa had pleasant recollections of the town, as did Dirac. It was, in his opinion, the birthplace of quantum mechanics, where he had first become acquainted with Born and his group, where he became friends with Oppenheimer, and probably where he first saw a Nazi in uniform. The Diracs stayed in Gebhard's hotel, overlooking Göttingen's railway station, where Dirac had first arrived in the town from Copenhagen 55 years before. Then, his journey from the station to his room in the Carriot's house was a luggage-laden walk. Now, he and Mansi were met by a welcoming party that whisked them in a taxi to the town's most luxurious accommodation. There are photographs of Kapitsa and Dirac sitting at a table in the garden of the hotel, looking exhausted and a little dispirited. Physics, one of their main topics of conversation, was now much less important than international affairs, the preoccupation of Kapitsa. He would almost certainly have spoken with Dirac about the recently ended Falklands War between Argentina, led by General Galtieri, and the United Kingdom, led by Mrs. Thatcher, over the disputed island territory in the South Atlantic. Dirac was in two minds about Thatcher. He feared the impact of her radicalism on British education and science, but sympathised with her determination to protect the Falkland Islanders' wish to remain British. He thought, however, that the dispute should have been resolved through negotiation at the beginning of the war. It had seemed absurd to him that the number of people likely to die would probably exceed the number whose British citizenship could be protected. In politics, if not in physics, Dirac was always a pragmatist. The Falklands War was a trivial matter compared with nuclear proliferation, a subject Dirac and Kapitsa talked about at length when they met again a few weeks later at the Eris Summit in Sicily, organised by the physicist Antonio Ziccici. Dirac took risks on the subject matter that he addressed there. During the previous summer, he had given a presentation on the futility of war, an uncomplicated statement of an argument that few would oppose. In the summer of 1982, he collaborated with Kapitsa and Ziccici to write the one-page Eris statement, which urged governments to be less secretive in defence matters, this being one of Bohr's favourite themes, to prevent the spread of nuclear weapons and to help non-nuclear powers feel more secure. The well-intended phrasing of the document, later signed by 10,000 scientists, was so bland that its first signatories at the Eris meeting included not only opponents of nuclear weapons, but also the far-right Eugene Wigner and the obdurately pro-nuclear Edward Teller, who had done more than almost any other American, to fuel the arms race. On the last stages of the Dirac's 1982 European tour, they visited Betty in Amsterdam and Gabriel in Aarhus, before travelling to Cambridge. Dirac returned to St. John's College, which, as he was to tell the master soon afterwards, has been the central point of my life and a home to me. That summer, the talk of the combination room was the imminent arrival of the college's first women undergraduates. Another all-male bastion of Cambridge was about to fall. Earlier, the theoretical physicist Peter Goddard asked Dirac whether he thought women students should be admitted to the college, and after a long pause, Dirac replied, "Yes, provided we don't admit fewer men." Before he left St. John's, Dirac left his gown at the Porter's Lodge, where he had first registered as a student almost 69 years before. He wrote a label on it, and it said, "Professor Dirac's gown. Please take it to the master and ask him to keep it for the next time I come to Cambridge." But he would not see the town again.